Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's threat briefing, the introduction to cyber supply chain threats and the weaponization of firmware. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be your host for today's session. I just wanted to go over a few little housekeeping items before we get started. The first is we are recording this session, and we will be making the recording as well as the slides available. I'll be sending a follow-up email out within about 24 to 48 hours after the conclusion of the presentation. Also, if you do have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A function, the box specifically, and we will address them throughout the presentation. We will take a couple of pauses to give Scott a moment to get a drink of water while he's talking, and also to address some questions that might be relevant right at the time. However, we will try to get to all the questions before the end of the session. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce my colleague, Scott Scheferman, who is our principal strategist in Office of the CTO, and he will be delivering today's presentation. Scott, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you everybody for joining today, and really looking forward to this this presentation. This should be really, really good. I'd like to think that this is probably one of the most important presentations you'll listen to this year. I believe it is, as you will see as we go along. First, a quick introduction. I'm Scott Scheferman, and I have a slide right after this. I'll kind of share with you my career progression and why I'm here, and I'm here now. But I do author our Below the Surface Threat Report, and that is a monthly report that dives really, really deeply. Sorry, I just got through a sinus infection here. That report dives really, really deeply into the threat landscape, and it's very curated, it's very in-depth, it's very bite-sized, easy to digest with tons of resources and links. And I really invite you to look into that and also connect with me there on LinkedIn. And I wanted to just introduce myself with a short story that really frames this entire threat landscape arriving where it is now, which is something that we often describe as a precipice, or a moment where the threat landscape has fundamentally changed. And in my career, I kind of progressed there left to right in the blue boxes, going back about 25 years. And the first, 17 years of that career was largely supporting federal and DoD systems, Department of Defense. Everything from submarines to satellites to million device networks. And so I worked in that space quite extensively up until about 2014. And the reason why I decided to shift that career, even at the pinnacle of that career, was because of a major event that happened that is public when the Iranian nation state hackers hacked the Navy Marine Corps Internet, which was a massive enterprise of over 1 million devices in 2,600 locations around the world, servicing the entire Navy business and many mission operations as well. And it was an interesting moment for us because we'd never thought of the Iranian threat at that time, back in 2012, 2013, as a very sophisticated threat. They were mostly defacing websites. But what ended up happening was they got into the NMCI from an externally facing software bug, and proceeded to stay there 4 months and root around the entire network. And we had to bring down the network. It was months and months of a DFIR experience. And that's when I realized that we could not see callbacks, which were malware beaconing back to the Iranian actors. So that's when I went to work for a company that invented the sandbox, to detonate malware before it runs, to know if it was bad or not. And also they were really good at detecting callbacks, which is why I went there in the first place. I stayed there for a couple of years supporting state and local governments. And then the era of polymorphic malware came about, and it was no longer good enough just to watch what it was doing. It was evasive. It knew if it was in a sandbox or not. Callbacks became more obfuscated, et cetera. And that's why I jumped then in the era in 2015 to AI-based or predictive, the ability to predict malware before it detonates, to know if it was bad before it actually runs. And I spent 3.5, 4 years there doing DFIR, including NotPetya and WannaCry, et cetera. And then once again, the threat actors jumped ahead of that paradigm where predictive AI and AV and EDR were simply not enough to keep the ransomware actors coming, the nation state hackers disrupting or destroying environments or doing espionage campaigns, et cetera. And NotPetya hit during that time. And I worked some of the biggest NotPetya things that you've read about in the news without mentioning client names, but you've read about them, causing billions of dollars of damage. And the primary reason that campaign caused so much damage is because it destroyed the master boot record on a hard drive, which made it impossible to restore, which is why you had months and months, in some cases, years of downtime in terms of operational downtime, ships out at sea unable to operate. This was impactful to me. I've always tried to stay ahead of the threat actor, going all the way back to 9/11 when I got into this kind of business, if you will. And that's what compelled me to go to Eclipsium, where I am now, because I realized we had a low-level threat that was the kind of threat that causes the most harm. And that's what I've always been, is mission-driven. I want to protect those that can't protect themselves the best way I can. And we're in this new era, whether it's for geopolitical reasons, economic reasons, obviously the war in Ukraine, escalating destructive attacks. We'll talk about that. But ultimately, I realized that the attackers are dipping down below the operating system. So I also do a ton of things with threat intelligence sharing, trust groups, and I'm very intimate with current goings on in terms of actual impacts that are taking place, some of which you end up reading about, some of which you never will. And with that, I'm going to turn off my camera so you guys can focus on the slides and we can have some fun. All right. So we're going to look at what firmware security is. When we say firmware, it's all that code running beneath the operating system. We'll look at some security myths I want to get out of the way right away, because these things held me back for 20 years in my career. And I did believe them before I came to Eclipsium. The third one is looking at firmware threats in the wild, like UEFI, cloud-based attacks and network devices primarily. And the fourth one is looking at supply chain attacks, which is really what this briefing is ultimately about. The idea that threats come both from the supply chain directly in the form of backdoors and rootkits and vulnerabilities, but also threats are able to attack that same attack surface from the operating system and go down. And if I just pause on that statement, you take one thing away, I want it to be that there are many vectors to attack this attack surface for which there have not been any security controls for. We'll look at drivers and middleware as part of the supply chain. We'll look at what the industry and government has been doing lately. In fact, they're actually ahead of us. And finally, we're going to end on the destructive attacks motif and ask you guys a question, like a little exercise, if you will. So when we talk about supply chain threats and firmware security, what are we talking about? Well, if you're familiar with the OSI model, if you're familiar just notionally with what a device is, a computing device, obviously at the bottom you have hardware, and there you have the firmware. We know that that is what allows software to talk to hardware and do things. And then you have the embedded firmware OSs. And above that dotted red line, you have the user operating system like Windows, Linux, Mac, and all the applications. And even above that, you have things like entire cloud stacks and APIs and containers and everything else that's been going on in the last 10 years. But where we focus and where the threat actors are going after all this threat brief, they're diving down underneath that red line, and for really good reasons we're about to explore and give you examples of. And I want to say this emphatically, that these attacks are the very worst of the worst type of attacker with the worst kinds of motives. There are many multi-year campaigns or highly disruptive or destructive campaigns. Even criminal motive type of hacker organizations are now leveraging the same tactics, borrowing them from nation states. And I think you'll be surprised when we start talking about that. Yeah, there's massive amounts of firmware, and suffice it to say, this is a similar kind of slide, but in the orange at the very bottom, you have so much. You have baseboard management controllers, network interfaces, your Intel ME or AMT, GPUs, obviously, your CPU and your hard drive. All of that presents an attack surface, and all of it is running massive amounts of code. In fact, there is a tremendous amount of code running. If I ask you guys how many operating systems on a typical server, and you say, well, I've got 10,000 servers or 100,000 servers, you might say 100,000 operating systems. Most of them may be Linux or Windows. The truth is there's 10 other operating systems running underneath that primary operating system. So the answer is actually a multiple of between 6 and 10 or even 12 sometimes operating systems. Most of those are running a Linux kernel, a Linux stack. It talks, it has APIs, it talks to the operating system, talks to the network. And this all presents attack surface, and it's all massive amounts of code The UEFI alone is larger than a full Linux distribution's kernel. You can play a video game in it. It has storage. You can run anything. It has its own network stack. There's been campaigns that exfiltrate data right off of the UEFI's network stack to hide from any kernel logging that the Windows operating system has. So yeah, there's the visual. You guys get it. We're off and running. That's a motherboard. You never want that to be destroyed. Otherwise, you have to restore the device component by component or replace it. So in general, there's two types of attacks, right? If you try to break this world into two things, there are those attacks taking place below the operating system. And there are those attacks on the left, and those attacks taking place on all of these network connected devices, some of them externally facing, and also critical security controls like firewalls, VPNs, and load balancers, storage devices, file transfer devices, certain IoT devices, etc. But all of them still have these sub-operating systems or device operating systems that present a massive amount of code and great advantage to the attacker. So we're going to talk about both. We'll probably start on the left and we'll move over to the right as we go through the conversation. If there's one slide I want you guys to walk away with, it's probably this one, because I've realized over the years that understanding what attackers are doing is not necessarily as important as understanding why attackers are doing what they're doing. That's a really big, important part of this whole thing when you're trying to get ahead of them. But ultimately, firmware provides the greatest form of persistence, the greatest form of destruction of a device, the most amount of leverage when it comes to extortion, the most amount of evasion, the most ability to go underneath ring zero, what we call sub-zero power, right? Like it's omnipotence. There's nothing you can't do as an attacker once you're there, including disabling other security controls. When I say other security controls, I mean the most important ones, the ones that ship with Windows, as well as third-party AV, EDR, etc. We'll talk a lot about that. Survive system restore. So yeah, you replace the whole hard drive, even restore from backup, even tape. I don't care. The attacker remains on the device, and you put that device back into an operational environment, and they pop right back up, and you're scratching your heads after spending $10 million on a DFIR effort. Plausible deniability pertains a lot to nation states that use the same tactics that criminal hackers do, the same off-the-shelf tools from OEM vendors and open source tools that are signed and trusted by Windows to do things. And so when you're operating at this level, you don't need to have a set of malware that is AV, EDR happy, that is easily detected with IOCs that you can attribute to an actor. Nation states love this especially. Ease of targeting. Well, this is a supply chain talk after all. And you've seen the dynamic in the news where attackers hit one source to get to many victims. That plays out in a number of different ways. It's a gray area. It's a very interesting dynamic. But the ultimate principle is that they can go to many victims with one vulnerability or one backdoor in a piece of software. Attacker reinitiation is what I just described about going back up after an attack. And then broad use of re-effort. You only need to kind of tool for one thing, and now that platform everywhere is vulnerable to you as an attacker. And you can also target victims downstream once you compromise victims that are upstream. In fact, the direction ends up flowing both ways, as we'll look at in our research. If you're not already looking at the CISA KEVs, the known exploited vulnerabilities from the USA's Department of Homeland Security, CISA, right? Everybody here is probably familiar. But in the last year or so, they've really done a good job of putting out a consolidated, actionable, defensible list of known exploited vulnerabilities coming from victims, both in the critical infrastructure as well as in enterprise, that we know are causing damage and doing bad harm to organizations of significance. And this list is something that I recommend every board press their CISO when I talk to the board and advise them, drive this list down and attack this list, because in any given year, there might be 20 to 60,000 discovered vulnerabilities. You're not going to patch them all. So focus on the 4% that CISA found are actually exploited. And that list is only something less than 1,000, between 800 now, or maybe it's close to 900, maybe not quite yet. But if you look at the distribution and you do research on what is this body of KEVs, because CISA doesn't really do that for you, they just give you them. So we did research on this, and we found out that in orange there the 1 in 4 of them, like 25% of these are firmware vulnerabilities, device OSs, window, below the window type of vulnerabilities, IoT, network attached storage, even cameras, but they're firmware vulnerabilities, even more than your typical, what we'd normally think of like web browsers and software libraries, et cetera. And there's the actual numbers and breakdown, and there's the link at the bottom for what I recommend you all do if you're not already is action these things. So yeah, the vulnerabilities are massive, but they're being attacked, and I want you guys to realize that. I'm going to go through this slide, and maybe we'll pause for a little bit of questions. But I have some myths I want to break, and what I call legacy assumptions, things like someone like myself or you guys that have been doing this for 30 years maybe have in your head as things that we make as assumptions. These attacks require admin level access. So you already have bigger problems at that point, right? So yeah, by and large, if you're going to attack the firmware from the operating system, you need to have admin or system level access. You need to do something like a UAC bypass, right? And so people, well, I got bigger problems. If they've got admin, they've got all the data. They can use the network. They can use the stack that Windows has. Let me tell you something. First of all, anytime you're doing threat modeling, which I've consulted for 20 years doing threat modeling, and I've made this assumption too doing that, you have to assume admin level access for any actor of any significance with almost any motive these days. Because on any given Sunday, there are a dozen ways to do a UAC bypass. In fact, Windows doesn't even consider it an actual security boundary that they are able to enforce. They know this inherently, and that's a complexity problem. I'm not saying that Microsoft isn't good at this. I'm saying there's no good way to do this because of physics and legacy support and all the other reasons that make Microsoft a difficult situation. So assume admin access when you're doing threat modeling, because every DFIR I've ever done, I've done 400 of them plus, the actor always did a UAC bypass first thing on the bots. The second one is my AV and my EDR, my email filters and firewalls, whatever other control, they should be upstream of these attacks, right? Shouldn't they stop these before an actor can get to admin access and dropping down to firmware? Well, two things here. One is A, attacks from the supply chain flow also from the bottom up. So if you have a baseboard management controller talking on the network, or if you're doing a firmware update for your motherboard or your UEFI or whatever it is, that's an HTTP session using really bad old TLS code sometimes, like in the BIOS disconnect research we did. Attacks can actually ship from the supply chain in the form of backdoors, default credentials that are easily exploitable without having to go to the operating system first. Attacks can be physical. What we often call the evil maid attack is much more than just a maid in a hotel scenario. These days, your devices are everywhere, and they go through an entire supply chain before they get to you, including shipping, including storage, and actors of many different ilk, not just nation state, are adept at attacking devices physically and implanting black doors on the firmware. So yes, all those kinds of attacks can happen vector-wise. But more importantly, on the other side of things, attacks absolutely go from the operating system down to the firmware all the time. And the reason why they do this is because those controls on any given Sunday often fail. That's why we're having this conversation. That's why bad guys are going this direction. Because once they're on a Windows box, the bear is on their back. It's a race against time to do their objective before an IOC is dropped or a persistence mechanism or lateral movement is detected as a network control before they're discovered and then chased down and eradicated. So in this new era of EDR, the main thing they're trying to do is buy themselves time. And the absolute best way to do that is to dip down into firmware and hide from all of those controls or disable those controls outright. The third, I've got a secured core PC with boot guard enabled. So I'm okay, right? I mean, maybe many organizations are doing tech refresh, especially financial organizations. And if you buy the marketing, if you will, that if you have a chip to cloud, secured core PC, that should prevent this from even being possible. It's absolutely not true. Secured core is a giant suite of controls, many dozens of controls all of which in theory would have to be shipped to you in perfect configuration and enablement in order for a secured core PC to stop even some of these attacks, and they'll never stop all of them. In fact, and to this day, our researchers, none of us have ever seen a secured core PC shipped with all of those controls configured properly from an OEM. So you're buying the capability of secured core, you're not necessarily buying the security of the concept of secured core when you buy that. And then every demo we've ever done in the last year since secured core has been a thing shipping, even on the most advanced up-to-date computers at any given time, is running a UEFI boot kit. Even the one in our CEO and founder's office, Yuri's office, literally has a UEFI implant on a perfectly configured secured core PC. The fourth one is these attacks can only be performed locally with physical access, so they're low likelihood, right? Well, I actually kind of covered that already. No, the perception is that firmware attacks are often physical, and that happens a lot in the wild, if you will. However, as we'll see, these attacks come from any and all vectors that we worry about in cybersecurity. Are there any questions on anything I've covered? I don't see it in the Q&A box, but if you have one, drop it right now. And please do use the Q&A instead of the chat. Okay, I'll keep moving. So there are a lot of in the wild firmware threats. The ones on this page alone would take 12 hours to cover, let alone the time we have today. But suffice it to say that many of these will jump out at you that you recognize. REvil, Maze, JungleSec, Mosaic Regressor, TrickBoot, which is the research and discovery that we did, discovering that the Conti TrickBot group has a module specifically looking at UEFI vulnerabilities to attack it. APT41, APT28, the Russian GRU, LoJax. All of these are ones that you've seen about if you're doing threat research, and all of these target firmware or are themselves direct firmware campaigns. And all types of devices are being attacked in the enterprise, right? In critical infrastructure, everything from laptops to servers, network equipment, and storage devices. And there's just some examples that we're not going to run through each one of what they are, but that's there for your reference. And we'll look at some of these actually. So like I said in the beginning, we'll break this world into two. And now we're going to talk about BIOS, AKA UEFI. That's the new word for BIOS for those of you that maybe aren't aware, and what examples there are in the wild of attackers hitting the BIOS. Go back one step. So UEFI bootkits, it's pronounced UEFI. Attackers love them for a lot of reasons. We talked about it a little bit, but it gives them omnipotence. But reading these bullets, the story gets bigger. Like you have indefinite, undetectable persistence on our device. And that's the holy grail for any attacker of pretty much any motive. Even destructive campaigns spend many months or even years in an environment before the switch, if you will, is turned or the payload is dropped. Going destructive. And that's especially in the case of nation state situations, especially in the current geopolitical climate where we have so much destructive action coming from both nation states and nation sponsored hacktivist groups and vigilantes. It gives you omnipotence and you're at the lowest root of trust. I should just say that the firmware we're talking about is itself the very root of trust, the seed of trust, if you will, for all of compute. Every data center, every cloud instance, every virtualized environment, every container environment, it's literally at the center of the root of trust. Every OS and every application on top of it needs to trust this for a device to boot up and trust that the code underneath it is not malicious and the device is what it says it is. This is how compute works as even a concept. So this gives the attacker that same power at the root of trust. It allows attackers also to disable OS level security controls. Everything that you read about that you trust and rely on every day. If you have an EAL5 license from Microsoft, you're rocking and rolling with Credential Guard, Defender, BitLocker, Intune, and all sorts of things that are meant to help defend that operating system. But the thing is that you can disable all those controls from the firmware because when you say BTOS, it means below the operating system, but it also means before the operating system. So those controls never even had a chance. You can render a device unbootable. That's really bad. You can't even restore it if you can't boot it. Unplanned downtime with a low chance of restoration. Again, a holy grail for destructive attacks like NotPetya and WannaCry. Impacts to worker, patient, and public safety are foremost when it comes to these threats, especially in the context of operational environments. And yes, these threats do find their way from enterprise IT over to operational or OT environments readily. UEFI bootkits can bypass all the mechanisms to control their whole systems, and they can not be removed by just reinstalling the OS or reformatting or even replacing the hard drive. And they flow in the blue there on the right from the software down and the hardware up for sake of redundancy on purpose. I mentioned it twice. There are a ton of examples. These are some. And if you look at this, they span from 2015, but it actually goes back to like 2010. A lot of these are ones you may have read about in the newspapers because they're some of the most gnarly campaigns with the longest persistence. All of these have something in common, that they're multi-year before they're discovered as a campaign, meaning the entire global security industry and cyber stack did not detect these campaigns for 3, 4, or 5 years before they were discovered in the wild as a massive campaign targeting an entire region or an entire vertical. And that's what makes these so nefarious, right? It's also one of the reasons why you don't hear about these campaigns in the news. You read about ransomware, you read about privacy instances and HIPAA, the need to report those, and you hear about anything loud that goes boom. Sometimes you don't always hear about those things, but what you don't hear about are these espionage campaigns because there's no reason at all or requirement or need for the victim to ever report them. Even though the material impact can be great, many of them choose not to. I'm sure the SEC is smiling at this conversation right now when it comes to material impact. Also, you notice on the right, the NAs in red, the red ink there. That's under the attribution column of knowing even who these actors are, and we still don't know who half of them are. Honestly, we barely know any of them other than LoJack's hacking team, Vault 7 for sure because of the leak, and we know TrickBoot because, well, we did the research on that, but we're not so sure about Moonbounce. We definitely don't know about Mosaic Regressor being WinNT. It's probably Russia, honestly, versus WinNT Group. Towards the bottom, the Conti leak chats, we'll talk about that. Super interesting what's going on in the criminal world. And then since this slide was created, we also have Cosmic Strand, one of the most sophisticated campaigns ever witnessed, ever, in many regards, not just the firmware UEFI aspect. And finally, Black Lotus, which I'm excited to talk to you about. So I'll move us along towards there. When we discovered TrickBot was the end of 2020. And again, TrickBot being a modular criminal piece of software, it only loads the modules it needs to do its objectives, and it loads them down via command and control. And at the time, Emotet was what was spamming out TrickBot infections to the tune of 40,000 infections a day if they wanted to. They had the ability to even turn that up further. And this is just prior to the TrickBot takedown effort that you might recall through Operation Ladybird. And what we found, though, is that this module called PermaDLL was one of the new modules that they loaded out of a half dozen or 2 dozen or so modules. And that module was designed to do only one thing, which was thoroughly inspect the UEFI. It would dive down and look for a specific vulnerability type that would allow TrickBot to implant at the UEFI. And that was that caught our attention, right? We hadn't seen anything other than nation states doing this type of activity. And there we are in 2020, and the biggest multinational criminal intelligence organization in the world, known as the TrickBot Conti Group, was now developing this type of code and capability. So it was bad. They even brought in the last bullet, the RW everything driver. It stands for read write everything driver. That's an open source GitHub thing you can go download right now. It's signed and trusted. It allows anybody at the operating system to do anything to the firmware underneath it they want to. And that's why criminals bring it along with them. They also the Russian GRU APT28, their LoJack's campaign brought it with them for the same reasons. It was found on all the victim devices. So that was a big discovery. But the implications were even bigger. It's literally, they could have bricked the device from the keyboard with like a command is like 1 line long. It would have bricked the device forever. The UEFI level is right. The right level is achieved, WRIT level, and attackers can gain back the time advantage against AV EDR. In fact, when we looked at the leaks, which we'll talk about next, that was their primary objective, was disabling other controls and being evasive. They can also attack any vertical they want to because of the ability to spam and target a vertical via spear phishing, right? So you go from a spear phishing campaign down to the UEFI. They no longer need to craft an attack knowing the target's platform. That's big. It used to be to target the firmware, you had to know the model. I'd land on a device that it's not this model motherboard with this OS running on it at the firmware. You couldn't target it because you didn't have a custom payload to exploit that vulnerability. Well, the BIOS write enable bit is a common bit set across many platforms on Intel all around the world in every environment. So it allowed them to have a much bigger blast radius on devices they could actually implant on. And the worst part is most organizations that vote there don't have the people, processes, or tech to get ahead of that threat at all, let alone recover from it. Your IR playbooks and all the kind of disaster recovery tabletopping you've ever done as an organization went out the window right off the bat. And it opened a new chapter for criminal malware groups to begin targeting the firmware and do it remotely rather than an evil maid or supply chain type of a physical attack. They also, so many of you read about the Conti leaks. This was during when Russia began to invade Ukraine in February of the prior year. There was a split in the TrickBot Conti group. This is a massive group with many hundreds of people, dozens and dozens of developers and affiliates. And one of them was not pro-Putin, he was pro-Ukraine, and decided to leak all of their internal chats across all their developers and all of their actors handling the money and all sorts of other stuff. And we did the research on this, and there was 60,000 messages that we looked through in Russian. We translated them. And we dove down to look for one thing, because that's our space. Nobody else was looking for this when they did the research on the Conti leaks. And we found that they were looking deeply at the UEFI and how to attack it via the Intel ME apparatus. Intel ME, otherwise the OS running AMT, is on like every Intel device shipped the last 12 years. This would even be a broader attack blast radius because it's on all of the things, the device right in front of you probably, right? So again, their primary objective was to disable and other controls and persist. And wrong direction. When you look at what they were doing, they were fuzzing the ME. They were looking for undocumented commands and vulnerabilities, not even in the documentation, just literally putting a lot of effort towards this. They're looking at accessing the spy flash so they can implant there. They're not only looking at a dropper, like placing malware on the host OS from the UEFI, but also via SMM. And SMM is a lot of people don't know this. It's a runtime running at your like full time, and it's always on, and it's like ring zero type of stuff. So if you don't have the ability to examine your SMM's integrity, you're not going to see this threat manifest, and you'll never be able to get rid of it. So they can modify the kernel on the fly with complete stealth without the OS or any AV or EDR being able to do anything. Insanely good research there. You can do things to mitigate some of these things. Obviously, since I'm speaking from Eclipsium's point of view, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we do all these things. We do them better than anyone. We do them uniquely so. We bake a ton of pedigree and tradecraft into our technology to be able to detect this type of activity where no other kind of platform, enterprise-grade platform possibly can. I would lean into that statement if I was looking at you eye to eye. So this is some of the things you can actually do, like scanning devices for explodable versions of ME, getting ahead of the threat, shifting the vulnerability left so that they can't even do it in the first place. The second one would be like monitoring ME for any configuration changes. Those things should not change on their own. So if you notice them change, that's probably bad news and something you should investigate. And looking at the spy flash itself and looking for any configuration changes there. And also BIOS and UEFI integrity. So if they got through all of that and they were able to implant it to UEFI, we can tell that it's been implanted and it's not what it says it is via looking at it via static code analysis, as we do. So that was 2020, right? And I've always been into threat research and trust groups on the darknet. And so you see things like this pop up in 2022 there in yellow. The third, maybe you could do, these are hackers talking to each other and developers, is you can exploit to get access to the UEFI. You can move around to the BIOS. You can focus on the spy flash. But the first idea is easier. So that was 2020. Fast forward 2 years later. And on October 7th this year, or late last year, I discovered something called Black Lotus for sale, right? I discovered it at the same time as another researcher did. And it was, the ad itself was striking, because if you look at all these things in yellow, these are things, again, we relegate to nation state type of attacks and tradecraft and know-how. And here it was for sale for $5,000. That is effectively a zero barrier to entry for any attacker that would ever do these types of attacks. It literally makes it practically free. These would normally be, 12 people in a room for 1 year and $100,000 budget, maybe, for a nation state, and now it's 5,000, right? So it was written in C. It was tiny, only 80 kilobytes. This is nation grade level stuff. It works globally with and everywhere else other than CIS states, the surrounding states of Russia. It's anti-VM, anti-debug, code obfuscation. If you ever got a hold of it, they did not want you to be able to easily reverse it to know what it is and what it does or where it comes from. It bypasses all your UAC, secure boot itself. We should pause there. It bypasses secure boot, and this would be the first UEFI bootkit to ever do that in the wild. Of course, it wasn't discovered in the wild yet. This was just an ad at the time. It can load unsigned drivers. It disables HVCI, BitLocker, Windows Defender, all the things. It persisted on the UEFI with ring 0 agent protection, meaning you can't do anything from the OS to kill it. It's impossible. It came with an entire guide and FAQs, and literally like any operator of any technical capacity at all could follow along and script this thing into their campaign, starting with the spearfish. It was that dumb easy. It's super stable. It scales to a lot of infections at once. It has the ability with a backend with full API, so you can do all your C2 data exfiltration, lateral movement commands. Like once you have this rootkit, you have a lot of capability. It's fully featured, file transfer, security, all the things that you would need to make this operational, and vendor independent. It didn't care what device, it wouldn't care what device it lands on. It's ready to go, and it scales to all the things, all the devices, right? Even if secure boot is enabled. Remember, secure boot is designed specifically to prevent this kind of thing from happening. It's the process by which the operating system is allowed to trust the device. And this bypasses it. All those nation state ones I showed you prior in that grid didn't do that. Okay, so that's the copy, the actual screenshot of the ad when I found it on October 7th, the day after it was first posted. But okay, so here a few months go by, not a whole lot. It got a lot of media and press, but is this real? I mean, there's a lot of discussion. This could be a lure. This could just be a fake or a scam. You pay them the money and they run. Or maybe it's a nation state trying to figure out who wants to buy from them. We didn't know, but it's now been discovered in the wild. There's 15, 16 samples now in virus total as I stand here, probably more now. This slide's about 4 days old. It bypasses the UEFI secure boot, like we said, using a vulnerability in Windows called baton drop. Now, you can go to GitHub and type in baton drop just like that and see the developer's code on how to exploit this vulnerability in secure boot. And it's a problem because it's effectively a forever day in secure boot. It's not something that you can patch at that level. It's a design flaw. It's a logic flaw itself in the secure boot process, if you will, right? Windows came out with a patch in January of this year to address one of the bootloaders, but it's not sufficient at all to mitigate this threat, as we'll talk about on the right side, but keep going down the left. It has its own signing key. It basically uses an MOK shim tool set, which is normally used for UEFI to boot on Linux, right? So if you want to do secure boot on Linux, this is the mechanism that does it. But it doesn't care that its Windows might be running above. It just needs to do what it needs to do with the signing key and install that shim, and it's good to go. And after that phase, it gives it everything an attacker wants: the boot time persistence, It has a payload that modifies the kernel to do anything they want to, like disabling those controls we talked about. And they now have persistence and full control over the operating system. The takeaways are even more profound. You have this forever day problem. Any attacker from here on out that replicates any portion of this type of overall tactic, all they have to do is bring a vulnerable bootloader with them. And there are many dozens of vulnerable bootloaders that are still signed and trusted by Microsoft, right? These are like legit binaries, if you will. They're not intentionally malicious, but they have vulnerabilities that allow you now to bypass secure boot and effectively implant the UEFI as a result. So the Microsoft patch is not the mitigation. Don't read about Black Lotus. I have the patch, I'm good. It's not like that at all, right? The only way in physics you could fix this globally is if Microsoft revoked all known vulnerable bootloaders. And not only do we not know all the ones that are vulnerable being used in the wild, but you can't do that because you would literally break every installation, recovery media, old backups. You would brick devices and potentially millions of devices that are operational globally. This affects, again, all platforms, right? So it's platform independent. That makes this a big problem. And you're thinking, okay, well, even if I got infected, if I just disable secure boot, can I restore? Doesn't that get around this problem? No, it doesn't. Unfortunately, the way secure boot is designed, you would not be able to restore that device. It would be bricked. The barrier to entry to pass secure boot is now much lower than ever before. Secure boot's been around a long time, maybe a decade going back, and it's done a good job this whole time, quite frankly. There are ways around it, but you've never been able to bypass it directly. And now you absolutely can as an attacker of most ilk and technical acumen as a result of this dealio. So Black Lotus there on the left, this is as it would appear in our product on one of many different kind of drill down screens. But this screen I wanted to show you because if you look on the left, you notice in the black circle there, the red icon is telling you that the master boot record or a bootloader, you have a problem there, right? The integrity of that thing is not known good. It's likely bad, right? So you detect this. And in the product, it would tell you have a Black Lotus problem, in fact, right? On the right, you contrast that with some of the other UEFI boot kits that we talked about, including Cosmic Strand, that is super sophisticated one. That one actually goes and writes to the UEFI, literally modifies the BIOS, the UEFI itself, and that's how the implant persists as a boot kit. Whereas Black Lotus is actually a bootloader that persists on the hard drive itself, right? So this is two different ways to slice up a similar kind of story. I have a question, and it's a really good point. Mung Fung Che, I hope I pronounced that correctly, says, I believe this is not the trust when it comes to secure boot. It's the basic checkup required to boot the device. Yeah, like yes and no, right? So yes, that is the function. Is the device what it says it is in terms of hardware? But the root of trust is still being protected by that check process, right? So it's, if you think of the root of trust as actually a crypto system, a system itself, yes, there's masks, yes, there's keys, but you have to protect that crypto system. And secure boot was a primary way to protect the integrity of the crypto system itself. I hope that makes sense. But it's not itself the root of trust in literal terms. That's a really good point. Okay, this brings us to our DEF CON 30 talk that we did last year at the 30th anniversary of DEF CON in the largest stage with a standing ovation at the end, standing room only. We dropped the bomb, which is one bootloader to load them all, just like the title says. Our researchers, Jesse and Mickey, that have been doing this for a very long time with pedigree that goes back to Intel Corporation, and they do a ton of research in this. They're very well respected in the industry. They found 3 bootloaders, same topic, right, as we were just discussing, that are signed and trusted, again, by Microsoft, that have these 3 different vulnerabilities. One of them, admin is required, but Microsoft doesn't consider that a security ban like we talked about. But the fourth bullet, one of them leaves secure boot on, but disables the checks. So it's really stealthy. Windows would tell you, yes, secure boot is enabled and good to go, but underneath the hood, it's not actually doing anything. And the other 2 have signed UEFI shells that effectively bypass secure boot. and allow an attacker to do whatever they want from that shell. The problem is these types of attacks are easily scriptable, and they're so easily scriptable that we can't imagine they won't be used in the wild. The updates need to be done in the correct order here. If you remember our boot hole research, if you did all those updates wrong to address the grub2 problem that we found in our boot hole research, you could break devices or break the restoration process, et cetera. The same kind of things apply here. You have to go in the right order and kind of be cautious how you do it. So make sure you look into that when you research these types of fixes. But what really stood out in this talk is I want to just give you a mental visual on the demo they did. The victim just gets a spear phishing email, just like you normally do. You click the thing. I don't remember if it was a macro or what kind it was. It's a common one in use today. And then from there, they effectively, in like less than a few minutes, end up writing to the, implanting this bootloader. And that is really, really powerful, that you can go from a spear phishing email to UEFI bootkit. And this is a big problem. When you combine this talk and research and demonstration with what we just talked about with Black Lotus, you can kind of see that you get this nexus, right, that we're at right now, this precipice where this is becoming low barrier entry, low cost, easy to do, scriptable and powerful, and deployable to many, many victims. Are there any questions on these UEFI bootkits so far? I really appreciated that one earlier on Secure Boot. Okay, I don't see any in the box, but write them anytime and I can stop when I see them. I have it up. All right, so we're going to move on from UEFI bootkits to how firmware and cyber supply chain affects cloud and virtual environments, right? Firmware plays a critical role in any cloud or virtual environment. And it sits at that root of trust in terms of like what you need to worry about when you're worried about, I got a question. Elaborate more on the time advantage against AV EDR. What kind of advantages does the attacker have? All right, so before I go down this path, let's pause there. All right, so the question is asking about why attackers gain advantage against AV EDR. And it's because they can disable it. So AV and EDR don't automatically detect everything right away. A lot of times a certain thing has to happen, a process, a persistence mechanism, a network call, an escalation attempt, a file with a hash. There's all sorts of things that happen on the hard drive that I'm guessing this audience is already familiar with. We've been talking about a lot in this industry the last 5 years. But the bear is pretty much on their back now so that eventually they will get caught. So it buys them time, and it buys them the ability to go underneath that AV stack and EDR stack. And once they're there, ironically, they can go up and then disable the EDR because now they have access to the kernel. Now they're at or below, in some cases, ring 0. And so every single agent product on an operating system hooks to the kernel. And when you have control over that kernel, or you're even booting, you're ahead of the boot process itself, you can modify and disable whatever you want to. In some cases, there's been an attack. I'm just forgetting the name as I stand here. But the attack, it loved the fact that it could use the UEFI's own network stack to exfiltrate data, right? So you pull data out of the kernel, you exfiltrate it off the stack of the UEFI. Guess what's not getting logged anywhere to the Windows kernel? That network traffic, right? So you can make that traffic look like a firmware update or anything else in terms of like your network stack that might be doing detections. You can also, on the destructive side, like you can brick a device. We all know that, but that comes into play during certain DFIRs I've been privy to, where once the attacker has been discovered, they employ what's called a scorched earth tactic, where they try to cause as much mayhem in the final hours as they can as they back themselves out and exfiltrate data. And so in the context of that part of certain actors that react that way, either when you don't pay them or they've been discovered as an espionage campaign and they don't want that to be attributed to them as a nation state, they use scorched earth. So it gives them that advantage as well to brick a device. You're not going to be able to do forensics on a bricked hard drive or motherboard, right? Easily. So there's other advantages as well, but I hopefully that covers it. It's mostly about gaining the advantage of time back that attackers have lost in recent years. All right, Cloud and virtual environment firmware threats. Hopefully everybody here has heard of a BMC, a baseboard management controller. It uses a protocol called IPMI. That's how it talks on its interface. And this protocol and these baseboard management controllers and the code of the software that runs on them is about as archaic and vulnerable as any software ever. It goes back decades, and this code has been reused with the same open source libraries and stuff that developers use and pack in here. And it's also been made to be usable when the darkest hour happens in, let's say, a data center. So you have things like default credentials baked into them, and they're not changed often in many data centers. And that's sometimes even a choice in operational environments, because if a certain operator gets hit by a bus and you need to restore a device, you want access to the BMC because it's your last line of defense to restore it. But what these things are they're always on. Even when your computer's off, your BMC is still running. It's still accessible over the network stack. It's a full Linux stack. It's literally an operating system running the whole time, even when you're powered off. And it's why it's called lights out management. There has been history going back as far as I can remember. The first time I saw these being a problem, I think it was Dan Farmer at a DEF CON talk back in like 2013, 2014. And he dove into these things, realizing that they all came from a certain geography. They're all made by pretty much some of the same makers. They all had default passwords. Some of them, the vulnerabilities were so silly, you could send like 29 alpha characters, like the ILO device there, and it would spit back the admin password to you. And just like that tweet, and that tweet's from 2014, notice that, right? All you had to do is send that and you'd get back the admin password. So they're historically horrible, and they still are. So the problem with BMC is they're always on, they're your last line of defense, and they sit under the operating system and enjoy some of the same advantages that other firmware type of attacks do. In 2018, Eclipsium did research on Cloudborne, what we called Cloudborne. This was kind of a novel eye-opener for all virtualized environments, for example, because if you go left to right, all the attacker needed to do was get into a guest operating system. And once they're there in the second step, they can use anything from BMC management tools, OEM tools, or other ways to access via IPMI BMC, or even the UEFI in terms of this research. But for now, we focus on BMCs. If the attacker can dip down to the firmware from a guest OS image, modify the BMC itself, and put in their own BMC code or backdoor, if the organization running the data center was not smart and they didn't completely wipe that BMC before reprovisioning the same device, guess what happens? The attacker comes back up from the firmware and goes to the next OS and application and another third-party victim who might be hosted on the same steal. This blew minds because that should not, in the concept of virtualization, one of the advantages is like the ability to just restore it, re-image it, like it's immutable, like all these, like with containers, etc., but not when it comes to BMCs and the ability to go down and access them. So this kind of blew minds, and people woke up for the first time that firmware is a big problem when it comes to cloud environments. And that leads us to research we just came out with. We called it BMC&C. It's a play on words, but you get it. BMC, the new Eclipsium vulnerability disclosure. And let me tell you a short story because it plays into the whole supply chain dynamic. The way we discovered this was because one of the primary ransomware actors targeting the IT supply chain itself for ransom and profit is an actor that hits all up and down that IT supply chain. Well, we found a leak, meaning that victim did not pay the ransom, and the actors decided, okay, we're going to leak your data now. And so they put it on the darknet for download. They made a mistake in how they configured that, and we hacked through it and we found a way to actually download it. So we think we're the first and maybe only researchers to pull down that leak. And what we found was amazing, eye-opening, ridiculous in many ways. Everything from source code to third-party keys and API. I mean, we found all the things, for lack of better word. We practically were that victim at that point in terms of like disclosure and what we had access to. So we did research on it, and we found some serious vulnerabilities And obviously, we went through the entire coordinated disclosure program. We used the US government. We worked directly with that vendor. They were absolutely amazing. They worked as hard and fast as they could to address these vulnerabilities. And now you see many, many vendors, because look, this affected all of your OEMs. Like any server in any data center anywhere on the planet globally, it's not even limited to a region, was potentially impacted by this vulnerability. It was so widespread because, again, this victim was at the top of that supply chain pyramid. What's interesting is there's several vulnerabilities found, but one of them, the second bullet, was an authenticated RCE, or remote code execution. And it gave you like everything you needed. It puts you basically at root. And that's a big problem when you're talking about BMCs. It allowed you to like remotely control compromised servers, remotely deploy malware or ransomware, any other kind of payload you wanted to, implant firmware, do physical damage like breaking a device. Any attacker that had access to the Redfish or IPMI UI, if you will, the interface, was able to exploit the vulnerability on this attack surface. So we now have a vulnerability with remote code execution over the network, or even from locally on the same device, that allows full control over the BMC. And from the BMC, the attacker can do anything. That's the whole point of a BMC or of a BMC itself, is to give admins that power to deploy, to restore, to do whatever they need to do. So how can they be attacked? From the internet directly. Your BMCs, if you're listening to this, should not be facing the public internet. I'll say it again. Your BMCs should never be facing the public internet. Now, after having said that twice, the truth is many of them are, and even an organization whose policy and wisdom would tell them not to, over time find that their BMCs get exposed to the internet for all sorts of various reasons, including the fact that we're in the COVID era, and much of the workforce for data centers is now working remotely, and they make that decision out of not convenience but almost necessity during certain COVID periods, right? So and a lot of those are left open now. So one short story on that is a group of researchers looking at AI platforms for vulnerabilities found that they could scan the internet and found these devices made by NVIDIA, DGX 150 or DGX 100 devices. That's like $250,000 device with 8 cores meant to do one thing, process AI at a really fast speed in parallel. And those things are found in like the most exclusive research universities and medical research and critical infrastructure research in the world. And they're accessible over the internet, the ones they found. And in the process of using IPMI over the internet, they found 9 CVEs. And guess what? It took the NVIDIA an entire year to be able to patch them, because they had to work with their supply chain upstream with Quanta. This is the nature of these threats. These vulnerabilities that are getting attacked are often 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10-year-old vulnerabilities that are still there. No wonder attackers are going there, all right? So the second bullet is, from a compromised VPN or load balancer, you can go directly to a vulnerable BMC on the same segment. From a compromised server host OS down to the BMC, much like the CloudBoard example we just talked about. From a guest image down to the BMC, same thing. From the adjacent device or an affected host on the same segment. So if you look at modern actors like Conti, one of the first things they do inside of an environment after a foothold is scan for all the network devices around them and use things like router exploit and other, what's the other one? Another one with the word router in it, to scan these devices and put themselves there for sake of persistence and evasion and for exfiltration and for C2. And the reasons why they do that is because, again, they know the bear's on their back. They buy themselves time to get off a Windows host with AV EDR on it and go to a network attack storage like QNAP device, a wireless device, a firewall even, or a VPN device from the inside. They can attack the attack surface of the VPN device. So understand the BMCs are attackable from almost any logical vector that you can imagine, even though in theory you think of them as being on a segmented management out-of-band network. Okay, so once you have the BMC, you can do all these things. I think I have covered most of these, so I won't spend too much time on this slide I don't want to be too redundant. But imagine an attacker just putting code in the BMC that stops and starts the server every X minutes, or they brick the BMC and now you can't even restore the device if you wanted to. There's a lot of things you can do. And of note, the last bullet, if you have a data center, a lot of times those are homogeneous. That's a problem. You have one BMC with a vulnerability like BMC and C in it. There's a story of 2 red teamers that hit a data center of 25,000 servers from the internet using a SQL bug, getting the server that the SQL bug was on, getting a shell back like you would do as a pen tester. Instead of playing around on the operating system and living off the land and doing all the things with Windows and domain controllers that you read about, no, they dipped down to the BMC on the same segment. And from there, they found more BMC vulnerabilities. In a long story short, they compromised 25,000 servers and 25 backup instances too of the entire data center, and could have put the data center down forever, like out of business, catastrophic. No, not mincing words here, literally could have destroyed the data center via that attack from a SQL server bug. And the broader takeaways here that tie into supply chain for us, for myself even, were profound. You look at this massively complex race to the bottom kind of economics where profit margins are minimal. You have massive competitive forces going down. That's why all this code ships insecure. That's why many different manufacturers borrow the same open source project, and that code's also 5-10 years old with its own CVSS 10 vulnerabilities in it. That's why the stuff arrives in your data center or on your desktop in front of you so insecure. It's a complexity problem, ultimately. We found keys and secrets, credentials, all up and down the supply chain. Attacks don't just flow top down. They also flow, in this kind of case, when there's a leak, bottom up. Because when you're developing, you have to share some of the, you don't have to share these things, but because of the forces at play, the market forces, developers do, for sake of efficiency alone, instead of using a third-party escrow key service to share secrets, like they should do in theory. The third bullet is something I just found recently. Last year, there's 142,000 source code commits related to firmware vulnerabilities on GitHub alone. And if you look at that and you kind of extrapolate from other research that I hyperlinked there that showed that 1 out of every 10 code authors exposes a secret, and 5.5 commits out of 1,000 exposed at least one secret. If you extrapolate the numbers on the back of a napkin, you end up with 781,000 potential secrets related to firmware shared in firmware code that's open source from just 280 users. Okay, this problem of secrets in open source is massive, and it continues to grow. Last year, there were 67% more secrets found across all GitHub than there were the year before in 2021. It's not going to get any better. And so, the bottom bullet and underline there is the most important takeaway. This does affect, this BMC and C research, devices in your servers. I don't guarantee it, but it's highly likely because it's at the top of the supply chain, covers many of the top tier vendors that are used in data centers. And it's everywhere. Questions on BMC and C, the research, or anything to do with baseboard management controllers? I'm hoping there are. And if you have one and you think of one, I can stop even though I go forward here. All right, so threat actors are targeting network device firmware. Okay, we covered the UEFI and BIOS and below the operating system. Then we covered BMC and Cs. Now we're going to cover the network appliances, load balancers, firewalls, network attached storages, some IoT, even Hikvision cameras. And we're going to talk about these things, and these are known exploited vulnerabilities too that CISA puts out all the time and warns us about. Prior to the KEVs, CISA used to come out with their top exploited vulnerabilities list, right? Each year. And in 2019, none of them were firmware. 2020, 4 out of 12 were. In 2021, 69% were firmware of the top exploited vulnerabilities that CISA is aware of in the whole world. In 2022, we don't have that list. They either haven't come out with it or they've shifted their focus just to the KEVs, and it's a new paradigm. But again, when you looked at those KEVs, 1 and 4 were firmware. It represents the largest category. And analysis showed the trend is growing heavily from 2005 all the way to 2022. Yes, there's tons of examples. Honestly, we don't have the time to walk through each one of these kind of reports. But if you just focus on the blue, you see that groups like CISA, Microsoft, SenseCry, even crowdsourcing lists that says, of all the vulnerabilities that ransomware actors use to get into the organization, their initial foothold, so many of them were hitting devices via remote code execution. And I want to break a paradigm that we have as another assumption I hear. Oh, they're using credential stuffing. Oh, they bought a list of users and passwords from our organization and they tried them as their VPN credentials and did a two-factor SIM swapping attack to get in via the VPN device. Yes, that happens. In fact, that happened during the meatpacking organization, that massive ransomware that affected the supply of beef all throughout the eastern seaboard of the United States. I forget the victim's name, not important. But guess what happened a month prior to that action? The Citrix ADC device itself was remotely compromised. Didn't read about that, right? So understand that the first step is remote code execution, meaning you own the device, and it's a powerful place to sit for an attacker. We'll keep going. I think I'm going to talk about this more anyway. So nation states as well, not just criminals. Again, CISA, NSA, I think hopefully everybody listening trusts some of these organizations, at least for their intelligence. The British NCSC, talking about Russian SVR, CISA again, in yellow on the bottom, again, all of them. Every actor of any significant motive whatsoever is using these externally facing devices to get initial and most powerful foothold into the organization. I'll stand by that statement no matter what you say. So please ask the questions. This is a big problem right now. It's a new paradigm. Obviously, certain nation state-backed actors from the PRC are hitting all of the things you see there: Zyxel, QNAP, Pulse, Netgear, MikroTik, Fortinet, all of those are what? Those are your externally facing devices, and those are remote code execution attacks. They've been doing this for the last 4 years straight. Russia as well, same group of actors. Some of these are the same CVEs shared across both actors, right? So just bear that in mind and understand that these devices are often not brought down for updates because of the COVID world we live in and the economy we live in. We've learned to live and produce and be productive remotely. So there's never a good time to bring down a VPN device to patch it. And also it's your primary security control. And this is why these devices remain vulnerable for many months and keep getting attacked for months after a vulnerability is disclosed. Some real world examples of this. F5, when this vulnerability hit, it's a 2022 CVE. 5 days after it hit, it was getting hit left and right by many different actors with many different motives. And once they were on, they were doing all sorts of bad things, causing a lot of impact, including some of these devices actually being destroyed, needing to be replaced. The problem with this is that the stuff is super easy to exploit. Like if you look at the code, it's like a line and a half long. You pop that into something like Metasploit, you're off and running. You own the device at root level on the Linux kernel that's running on these devices. They're nothing more than a server running Linux with the same hardware underneath them of the laptop in front of you, right? So they're extremely easy to exploit. Some were destroyed. And we demonstrated the further ability on these same devices to persist indefinitely, even across reboots, right? Prior to this kind of discovery and tactic, you would mostly have to reboot this device and you can get rid of code that was malicious in memory. But now it's actually being written to the device and surviving reboots. Right after that, Fortinet had a big problem, right? These are big, massive names of vendors that you guys know and use, right? This was a similar kind of problem on FortiGate, FortiProxy, and their switch manager. The problem here is that these HTTP headers are not being validated properly. So there's actually an assumption being made at the development level inside of these organizations and the code that they're building that they're improperly trusting these headers. Our own Nate Warfield, who does a tremendous amount of research on this and speaks on different stages at hacker conferences, dubs this as header stomping. And he really thinks it's going to be actually a new systemic kind of problem across these type of devices because it's not being accounted for during the SSDLC process itself. And once you're again, you can do anything you want. Change network configurations, add new users, initiate packet captures, and you have a point of presence on these devices on the inside of the network. You have access to things like Active Directory, and some of these are tied even to Active Directory. You can do what you want. You can deploy malware, ransomware payloads. Okay. similar kind of device is a file transfer device. Maybe you've read about the CLOP or TA505 threat actor, a really nefarious criminal actor group that often extorts organizations, not by ransoming them, but holding their data hostage for payment. And what they found was, why would I mess with the inside of an organization and an operating system with AV and EDR on it, when all I need to do from the internet anonymously is hit this externally facing device, compromise it, and guess what's on that device? It's a file transfer device. All of the most important information that you share with your partners or your customers or your medical research that's sensitive. And so they were hitting government, finance, healthcare, legal, manufacturing, higher education, breaking all sorts of compliance rules in the process. And this was a really big problem. If you look at the attack chain, it was a series of attack vulnerabilities that were chained together to compromise this device. I have a question, I'll pause. Can we consider recent that most ransomware is related to firmware implants on the UEFI? I do understand the question. It's a great question. I wouldn't say so, no. The word most is what I'm struggling with there. You can say that the single biggest group and apparatus for that all of the ransomware actors follow for sharing code and development and tactics and new strategies, the Conti TrickBot group, right? That group has been dismantled by law enforcement in efforts by certain individuals and groups and governments. But what happened was it fractioned into 12 other groups. So the same people and the same affiliations and the same trust and the same sharing of tactics is now renamed into 12 other groups using various things from call centers to spear phishing, spam campaigns, and you name it. So the answer is yes and no. You can't say most. Most ransomware actors are not going down to UEFI. That would be an incorrect statement to say. But the ones that matter most that everybody copies, and you look at things like Black Lotus for sale for $5,000, easily scriptable, zero cost of entry effectively for a group like that. And there's no reason why they can't or they aren't already, and we just aren't seeing it. When TrickBoot happened, we only saw that hitting TrickBot's HVT list, high value target list. Those organizations, many of them actually cybersecurity vendors as it happened, right around the time of the SolarWinds discovery, were TrickBot infections where the PermaDLL module was uploaded to the victim, right? So it's like a yes and no answer. And the problem is there's no telemetry. Your stack can't see this after they dip down if they are going to UEFI. And that's why they keep popping back up after you think you get rid of them. It's a really great question. I really do appreciate that. All right, so yeah, the point here is why go into the network if you can just get all the data and extort the organization for that data by hitting the firmware on that device. QNAP, I guarantee you, all of you listening have a QNAP device in your enterprise, maybe 20, maybe 30. And these are storage devices. There's also one by Asus Tor, a different manufacturer, a similar type of device. They have a number of vulnerabilities that are getting hit in the wild. That's an understatement. They have like 12 vulnerabilities. In fact, I don't think there's another manufacturer in the CISA KEVs that has more known exploited vulnerabilities being hit in the wild than this vendor. So understand that if you have those in your environments, you need to pay really close attention to them, keep them fully updated, and monitor them as well. Treat them like an attack service that you anticipate the actor targeting. And they're not just doing it for, so there's some attacks that ransom the data on, like encrypt the data on that device as a file storage device. But other ones are using it for C2. So if you think about Pulse secure devices there on the bottom right, certain actors are actually running their command and control and their exfiltration routines through a QNAP device, then using a CVE to hit the VPN, and then going inside the network to hit all the Active Directory and everything else. And your network stack doesn't see that traffic because it's meant to be like trusted traffic from two devices that are not really thought of as malicious. So it flies under the radar. It's a very powerful device for attackers, and they know it inside out, and it's so vulnerable, it's basically a free computer to use anytime you find it. Pulse Secure is another large VPN manufacturer, very expensive one, right? Like a very robust, sold to the largest enterprises and critical infrastructure on the planet. And they have a tremendous number of these vulnerabilities and similar type of problems. The VPN, let's see. Yeah, so I'm going to show you a video right after this. It's only like 2 minutes long, and I think your mind's going to get blown. Let me just do that really quick. But they have a ton of CVEs, and these are some of the ones that the nation state-backed actors from China and Russia hit routinely. In fact, Iran, North Korea as well. So here's the video, and it says medical device, but ignore that. I made this for somebody else. And what's going to happen here is that an attacker goes from the internet. They compromise the Pulse Secure device. From the Pulse Secure device, they have a shell using Metasploit, the same thing any red teamer uses on any given Sunday. And from the Pulse Secure device, they attack a Windows device. From the Windows device, they bring along with them some Intel tools, like a flash tool, and they implant and flash the UEFI. All of this takes place in like under 3 minutes in this video, this is from the internet, and there's no attribution that you're going to have here. You're not going to see malware anywhere. So let me hit play and I'll walk you through it. And turn the volume off so you don't have to listen to music. So yeah, you're going to hit the device from the internet. This is just an overview. It's almost over. And we're going to start right off the bang really fast. Okay, this moves really fast. But you have the interface coming up for the Pulse Secure device, the management interface, sometimes accessible from the internet, sometimes from the inside. But in this case, we're going to hit the interface, pop it using Metasploit, MFS console. I'm going to load the exploit and pretty much hit the button. Point it at the device and hit the button. And boom, you got a shell right about now. Okay, so now you actually have root on the device on the Linux kernel itself. There's that many vulnerabilities for this type of device. 2 of them are critical. 2 of them are 8.8s. You're going to do an ifconfig to look your interfaces on the device you just hit. You're going to find the one that talks to the internal network. From there, you're going to do basic hacker stuff. What would you normally do? Well, you're going to scan and find victims. Well, they found a Windows victim talking on port 445 and 139. I'm going to send that Eternal Blue. That thing still works, by the way, all the time. The DFIRs all the time are dealing with that vulnerability. So now that you pop the Windows device, what are you going to do as a hacker? Yes, you can use Mimikatz and hit the Active Directory. Yes, you can live off the land or drop malware payloads, but why not do this instead now, right? Now that we can these days. They bring along an Intel OEM tool meant to flash the UEFI. You're watching this in real time. This is how long it takes to actually do. Done. The device reboots. In this case, you do need a reboot. So maybe you notice that as a SOC or an operator. And after it's rebooted, you now have a permanently implanted UEFI malicious code running that no backup and restore will recover from, and no AVDR will ever find, and will disable all those controls and even make them look like they're still working so you don't even know they're disabled. Things get really bad from there. And that took how long? I don't know, a couple minutes. Yes, our product does a really good job at finding these devices. We really focus heavily on those devices that are actually being exploited in the wild, letting you know. So you might have like Qualys or another like vulnerability scanner that's supposed to tell you if these are vulnerable or not. And maybe they do, but have you sent somebody over there to validate that the vulnerability is actually not a false positive? Or maybe you issued the command to NetSecOps teams to patch this, but they choose not to because they can't, because it's a critical uptime device as a VPN appliance. And so your exposure is this long that you as a risk manager or CISO sit back and say, I need a dashboard that tells me right now what my attack surface is that externally facing and even internally facing for firewalls like Cisco devices, ASAs, RV320s, like all these devices have these same kind of vulnerabilities that are really bad that attackers love. And you may not have the ability to centrally understand what that attack surface is and how effective your patch operations are. So we do that for those types of devices. Okay, I want to pause for questions on all these externally facing network appliances. And by the way, it's not just externally facing, like the Colonial Pipeline attack. Part of that attack was a Cisco ASA that got hit internally, one that sat between the IT and OT network. You know, that air gap device that's not supposed to have the ability to transverse that. That was a vulnerable device that was attacked, right? So a lot of this is actually internally facing for large enterprises as well, including those same Pulse Secure vulnerabilities that you can hit from inside the organization once you've landed. Questions? Okay, I keep going. I might accelerate through some of this just so we get to the stuff at the end I really want to make sure we cover. But supply chain dynamics, we've talked about already. But if you think about on the right, There's all these upstream vectors that happen before you take delivery of a device, and you don't have any visibility or security control over any of it. But you take this device, you turn it on, you load the OS and applications, and that's it, job done. That paradigm has now broken where we are in the year 2023. It's been broken for 3 or 4 years, summarily broken. But the problem is the bad guys know about that problem. And they know that you don't have the tooling and the security stack and the people to solve for it, and that you're still implicitly trusting your devices at the device level. So it can happen any distribution, warehousing, even the delivery organizations have malicious actors in them all the time that have been planted there in multi-year campaigns. But also, once a device is taken delivery in its own operational context, it's still a very vulnerable device for physical security reasons, network security reasons, from the operating system down reasons like we've been talking about. A lot of these bugs are actually there as features. So some of these bugs will never get fixed, like the secure boot one we talked about, Baton, whatever it was called, Baton. So the supply chain is a difficult problem to address unless you have device level, firmware level visibility. And we know that there's a dynamic we read about, SolarWinds, Sunburst, the Supermicro attack where Supermicro servers were implanted. You read about that in Bloomberg. Shadowhammer, that was interesting. An ASUS live update utility meant to update the motherboard was itself compromised from the proper ASUS source, putting in malware that was looking at MAC addresses to know if that campaign wanted to hit only a very small select group of targets that they knew the MAC addresses for. That should tell you there's a nation state behind that attack, because they could have hit hundreds of thousands. In fact, I think they actually deployed to 200,000 devices, but payloads were only sent to a small list of MAC addresses. Yes, this stuff happens, but that's not the whole story. The fact is the ICT supply chain itself is now a primary target. Attackers have tremendous leverage disrupting that supply chain and operations, or exposing those secrets, like in the BMC and C research we talked about, is a material impact event for those organizations. Like, this is the worst of days, right? So attackers love that leverage to extort them for money. And it's no longer just about the fact that they have the data that they're now leaking because you didn't pay the ransom, or they're selling on the dark net. It's now the fact that that data is in the hands now of other attacker groups. That source code of the IT supply chain, those keys, those secrets, those default passwords and backdoors are now in the hands of the dark net, right? So it's a compounding problem we have. Yeah, you get it. Questions on the supply chain. I just wanted to frame up why this is such a problem right now. And I'll keep moving until you drop a question. So also part of the supply chain are what we call middleware, or drivers. So when you get a device, it also ships with a driver that allows you from the operating system to update the UEFI, or to do anything else that drivers do. Your sound cards, your display monitors, your mice, whatever. All these, like if you run a video game and the video game has an anti-cheat kernel hook, that's a driver doing that. And those video game drivers that North Korea actors, nation state actors called Lazarus Group, are bringing along with them, so they can actually bypass Windows admin level and go and do bad things. And attackers use these to escalate privileges and bypass controls because they're operating at kernel level, but they also use them to be able to dive down into the firmware and do bad things, right? So look how close those drivers outlined in red are to the hardware. They're the last kind of software before the firmware happens. You get it. And that one, RW Everything, is runs on Windows 64-bit. It's signed and trusted. It's open source, and it still works today. And that's the one that TrickBot brought with them, as well as the Russian GRU. There are different ways you can bring a driver to an operating system as an attacker. BYOD, bring your own vulnerable driver. That's really heavily in play right now. Those are some examples we're not going to talk through, otherwise I'll be here all night or all day with you guys. You can find a vulnerable driver already on the system. That's not uncommon to do. There's so many. I've been doing DFIR for a long time. Way back in 2016, we kept seeing this one called winio.sys. Yes, that's in your environments right now. It's in every single interesting environment I've ever been in. The problem with that thing is it's not even vulnerable. It's actually working as designed. You send it a command and it executes at root, system level, I should say. So the problem with that is it's everywhere already. So we were seeing nation state Chinese actors of Chinese nation state nexus leveraging that as far back as 2016. It's still in play today. And that driver is like itself, like 20 years old. I think it was like an audio driver that a Polish guy published a long time ago and is still in use everywhere. The third bullet is OSS drivers that are trusted by the user, but allow user land to system level privilege. Again, there it is, rewrite everything. And Dixie drivers like ntfs.efi, you're familiar with that, also used by LoJax, right? APT28. Vendor tools like UFI flashing software. You just saw that in the video I showed you, the demo using an Intel flashing tool. Malicious drivers, a slingshot campaign. So drivers can be made by good people or they can be made by bad people, if you will, like with malicious intent. And those are very, very effective as well. And things like the one bootloader to load them all and Black Lotus would allow you to use a malicious driver at the operating system if you want to. All right, questions on drivers. Again, part of that same device supply chain, right? The same vendors that you're implicitly trusting, you're actually trusting at the OS level as well in the form of the drivers. And you have no control over how those are developed and how they land on your system. So the next section is probably one of my favorite, but I'm going to spend the least amount of time on it. So I'm going to move fast and hard, all right? The industry and government awareness related to the cyber supply chain and also the ICT supply chain, the communications technology supply chain, the United States and the UK as well, at least in terms of my awareness, they're actually ahead of industry right now. The executive order that the President Biden's office put out on May 12th of last year was really amazing because it called out the need to protect critical software. But what is critical software? Well, they gave you 5 criteria for what is critical software. And lo and behold, if you walk through each of those, which we won't spend too much time on, they are all quintessentially, fundamentally, and in some cases, even by definition, the absolute most critical software in any enterprise, right? Firmware itself. Yeah, high level of privilege, 100%. Integration with other software. Yeah, how about the whole operating system? How about the whole IT supply chain upstream of it during firmware update processes? Direct access to networking and computing resources? Literally. Performance of a function critical to trust? Yeah, secure boot, OS loading, certificate trusts. Potential for harm if compromised? The very worst potential. The impact potential here is of the worst ilk possible. So they did a 1-year study there on the left, DHS did. It was a 1-year study. It ended up being like a 97-page report. I have some quotes from that coming up. And then shortly after that, the executive office, the president put out a memorandum, and that calls for all manufacturers shipping code to the federal government to attest that the code is done properly and secure. Like all those F5 and Fortinet devices, now they have to worry if they're selling to the federal government. They're not allowed to have vulnerabilities in there, and they have to attest to that fact. This is a step in the right direction. But in that ICT 1-year-long study, if you look at some of the outlined, I put it in yellow so we can move fast, but they describe firmware as a large and ever expanding attack surface, a single point of failure in devices, and one of the stealthiest methods in which an attacker can compromise devices, again, at scale. These are not one-off attacks like we've envisioned the last 20 years locally on a single laptop. These are ways to compromise entire cloud infrastructures, entire data centers, entire enterprises, and operational environments. Third bullet, attackers can subvert the OS and hypervisor visibility. Well, what have we been saying all day long as you listen? That's exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it, and can inflict irrevocable damage. Now, the problem with that word is, after NotPetya hit, we learned that we need backups hard drives because the MBRs were destroyed. Now we're talking about motherboards and entire devices. And who has those on a shelf? Nobody. Firmware can also be a lucrative target with a relatively low cost of attack, right? So we just covered that with Black Lotus. So they're on it, right? And that's going to lead me to destructive attacks. But any questions on kind of the fact that this is now a board level conversation And if you couch this against the chip wars going on, you couch this against destructive attacks and certain countries like Russia being heavily sanctioned in their IT, all gloves are completely off. The offensive attack, the political will to launch offensive attacks against other nation states by nation states has never been higher. Right? It's literally a slugfest right now. All gloves are off, and we've kept those gloves on for the last 30 years of my career. And only in the last year and a half or two have they come fully off. So it's really a different world. And that leads perfectly into where we're going to end, right? Which is destructive attacks. And if I could lean into one aspect, I really want us to get ahead of this, to anticipate this. And be ready and do the things we need to do to be ready to prevent these attacks, but also know how you'll respond if one does manifest. Both of those sides of that coin of prevention and response are fundamentally important to re-examine and start topping for the first time again, all over again. I did a ton of research when Russia first invaded Ukraine, and I found all sorts of firmware level attacks and wipers in particular, well over a dozen of them in the first several months. And a lot of these hitting MBR, low level stuff. Even satellite, Viasat was attacked and brought down communications all over Ukraine and parts of Europe. And that also involved an externally facing device, by the way, to get to the satellite management network. The point here is that you now have a large number of hacktivists. And on the left, you see all the ones that are pro-Ukraine. In the middle, pro-Russia. On the right, you have some that are a mix of two. Some you don't even know where they're going. Some of the Chinese nation state activity is heavily targeting both Russia and Ukraine, and obviously the West as well, and NATO allies. But the hacktivist aspect here, 84 of those groups, and this slide is like 2 months old, there's now over 100 groups. And their political will is very different. They want short-term gains. If Russia were to try to bring down Western critical infrastructure, it might begin with a year-long espionage type of campaign to understand business processes and how to cause maximum disruption or destruction prior to dropping the payload inside critical infrastructure. That's not true when it comes to hacktivists. These are short-fused, often nation-state backed and funded or encouraged, and even directed in some cases, especially with groups like KillNet out of Russia. And they've been given carte blanche to hit Western and NATO and allies of the West. It's a really, really interesting dynamic because the political will is not even part of the equation anymore. Simply put, they are those that stand to do the most harm to a mission when it comes to firmware attacks. They can brick the motherboard, and I'm being redundant here from the whole day on purpose because I want to nail this home. You can't restore from local and cloud backups anymore. You can't just replace your hard drive. Systems need to be built from the motherboard up, component by component, and you don't have the skilled labor, and hardware supply chain constraints are making this even worse because you can't replace the device either anytime soon or sometimes at all. So the exercise I normally walk people through, because we're all so familiar with NotPetya, and I lived through that with 6 different victims and 3 of the biggest ones. And the problem with this worm is that not only was it a worm, it hit the MBR and destroyed the hard drive, which made your recovery much longer, exponentially longer than just encrypting data, right? So it wasn't really a ransomware campaign, despite what we read at first. It was a 100% Russian APT-28, the Russian GRU, targeted destructive attack powered by a worm. Okay, it wasn't like NotPetya, which was an escaped worm out of Ukraine. So now you have the $5,000 boot kits like Black Lotus, which, by the way, have equally destructive potential with just a few lines of code to brick the UEFI, right? You have equal problems when you're dealing with this that are destructive. So I want you in your heads to go back to your tabletopping and your playbooks and say, if the next worm happens or when it should happen, if the same actor, literally the same one, Russian GRU, were to attack your critical infrastructure and operational environment, but brick the motherboards instead of the hard drives, what then happens? Is it catastrophic for you? Which devices are my most critical? I cannot have this happen on. Do I have visibility into the vulnerabilities that would be used to brick those devices at the motherboard level? Do I even know what my risk is to register it on the enterprise risk register or in the operational environment when it comes to safety and uptime, right? Those things need to be summarily revisited. And I wouldn't have said this 3 years ago. I wouldn't have even had these words because it's a different world now. And not only from the threat landscape, from the motive side, not only from the motive side, from the actual technology and tactics side. And now you bring in the supply chain aspect to this, and you realize we have a big problem we need to get ahead of. So yeah, replay NotPetya with bricking the motherboard. I'm near to finishing. I'd love more questions as we go. So start typing them in so we can go right when I end. Eclipsium, we do world-class firmware security reachment. I think that's an understatement. I mean, our founder, Yuri, has been speaking at Black Hat, DEF CON, and other conferences for well over a decade on this. In fact, even though Black Lotus is the first in the wild malware to bypass secure boot, our founder and CISO was showing how to do that 11 years ago or so at a talk, right? I still have the deck up. So it's not like this hasn't been coming. It's that it's arrived. And so we do a lot of research, both for sake of education awareness, like this talk you're listening to today, but also because it's on us to inform the supply chain of these vulnerabilities so that they get fixed, right? It's on us to work with DHS and CISA to let them know how to describe these in the context of KEVs, in the context of MITRE attack. Where do these fit in the kill chains for given actors that might target your vertical, right? So all of these things are a mission of ours and also a necessity, because our solution is literally designed to do one thing extremely well, which is address everything I've talked about today that the rest of your stack doesn't. But when it comes to education and research, we're just phenomenal. So I encourage you to do that. The top 4 takeaways I'll leave you with. Whether it's a threat to or from the supply chain, those are the ones that stand to do the most harm. Of all the known exploited vulnerabilities when we did our research, 25% of them were firmware supply chain vulnerabilities. If you want to counter this surge of activity, you need binary level visibility. You cannot trust Windows to tell you what it thinks the firmware is, because a malicious firmware will lie to Windows and Windows will lie to you, and you will make poor risk decisions. Okay, so you have to have a solution that understands firmware, that can literally inspect it, do static code analysis, has millions of lines of binaries that are known, good, and trusted, so that we know when something looks wrong and is wrong. When you can identify a LoJax implant, when you can identify a bootloader that comes from Black Lotus for $5,000 for a criminal, that's when you start making headway. Okay, so the 4th one is both APT and criminal actors are taking full advantage of this lack of visibility to control their victims. And that's where I want to end. And I really would like to invite some questions or even dialogue. So, even in the chat, if you ask a question, I answer, let's hear the next. And obviously, please shoot an email to info@eclipsium.com with any questions. You want to see a POC, you want to do a POC, you want a demo. If you do a POC, my personal recommendation is to do it in your most critical environments so that you actually have some raw data to work off of that matters most for your risk register and visibility. The first step is always going to be understanding what is my risk so that you can either accept it or you can mitigate it and get ahead of it. I don't see any questions, so I think I will end this presentation, and thank you all for listening. I'm here anytime on LinkedIn. Follow me. Please read the threat reports quarterly. One's coming out at the beginning of next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you everyone for staying with us this whole time. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Again, if there were any last minute questions, we will grab them and make sure that we address them afterwards. I did also want to remind everybody we did record the presentation, and we will be sending out the links to the recording as well as the link to the slides and some additional resources. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next threat briefing. Thank you, Scott, and we hope to see you all soon.